Right, shall we start? Thank you, thank you everybody for making the long trek down here. I'm going to assume that if you've walked round the corner, down the stairs, round the corner a bit more, down the stairs a bit more, descended the 5 miles down into the bowels of the earth to get here, you're a real Power BI fan, right? Good. All right, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to leave. When I submitted this session about 6 months ago, I thought, well, okay, data privacy in Power BI, obviously everybody's going to know that this is a deep Power Query related session about the data privacy features in Power Query and Power BI. Obviously, this week we announced a whole bunch of features to do with data protection and enterprise information management, which are very cool, but I am not going to be talking about any of those. This is all about Power Query data privacy settings and that formula firewall error that you may or may not have seen. So if you want to leave now because you were expecting something else, don't worry, I'll not be offended at all. Turn off your cell phones, blah, 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 blah. Let me introduce myself. So my name's Chris Webb. I am now a member of the Power BI Customer Advisory team at Microsoft. And I would consider myself a real serious Power Query fan. I like my Power Query, I like my M. It's something I blog about an awful lot. And this is going to be a real session for the Power Query geeks out there. Some sessions I do a kind of 100, 200 level session, and it might take you a day to prepare. This is, I think, one of the most complicated sessions to prepare that I've ever done, mostly because it's got difficult concepts, and to be able to explain difficult concepts in a simple and easy form takes an awful lot of thought. What's more, it's one of those topics where even after I've blogged, I did a 5-part blog post series on this, apart from all of the other blog posts I've written, there is a lot of incomplete, inaccurate information out there on the internet people have blogged about, not because people are wrong, but simply because people are trying to work all this stuff out, me included. And what I wanted to do in the next hour and a quarter is distill all of the knowledge on this subject that I've built up over the last couple of years. Now I work at Microsoft. I wanted to kind of grab the information from the developers who now are obliged to answer all of my questions and have the definitive statement on this subject. Still not quite there. There's still a few things that are maybe a little bit fuzzy, or whether the product is a little bit inconsistent. But I would say this is going to be everything I know about data privacy settings in Power BI. I'll also apologize, I'm going to be coughing and spluttering a lot through this because I've got the cold that everybody else has got. Okay, what are we going to be covering today? We are going to build up from absolute first principles everything to do with data privacy. This data privacy settings are in Power Query, Power BI, to control how data flows from one data source to another and potentially stop that happening. So we will talk about what data sources are and how you identify them. We will talk about the data privacy settings that can be associated with a data source. We will talk about data privacy and query folding and how the two subjects meet. We will talk about partitioning of query steps, which is going to be an interesting subject. We'll talk about more types of errors that you might encounter and how to get around them. And then we'll talk about how data privacy settings are treated in the Power BI service, not just in data sets, but also a little bit in custom connectors and in data flows as well. So let's get going. As I said, in Power Query, the data privacy settings that we're going to be talking about today are all about allowing you to control how data flows from one data source to another. And if we're going to be talking about data sources, it's going to be helpful to understand what a data source is and where we can find them. When I talk about data sources in the world of Power Query and Power BI, a data source is identified by two things. Its kind, for example, SQL Server, Excel, text file, or so on, and its path. So if we're talking about a SQL Server database, it's going to be the combination of the server name and the database name. And each data source, when it's been identified, has credentials associated with it. So when I connect to it, how do I authenticate? Is it going to be Windows authentication, username, password, or whatever? It's got a couple of other properties that will get associated with it, and it will have data privacy settings associated with it. Let's change to my reading glasses. I'm getting old. Let's start to do some demos. Lots of complicated demos in this session, so excuse me if I get a little bit mixed up, but I've been practicing them. Okay, so here is my Power BI file with all my demos in. I'm going to go to the Power Query editor, where all of the fun starts. And for all of my demos, I'm going to be using a very limited number of very simple data sources. Here is an Excel file. The Excel file has one worksheet. It has a table on, and this table has a column called day name, and in that single column, in the single row, is the day name Monday. So one of my data sources. We'll close that. I've got a SQL Server database here, good old AdventureWorks DW. And in AdventureWorks DW, we've got a table called DimDate, which is a date dimension table, which has got all of the obvious things that you would expect in a date dimension table, and it's got a column called English day name of week, and each date has a day name, which you can imagine we can match up with the day name we've got from Excel. So these are going to be my two principal data sources for everything I show here. If we go to the Power Query editor, you can see I've got tons and tons of queries all prepared for you. What are the data sources I'm using? Well, you can find the data sources that you're using by clicking this button here, Data Source Settings. When I click on it, you'll see we get a dialog up. Now, by default, what you'll see is a list of all of the data sources in the current file. And in the Power Query editor, what's happened is that it's gone through all of my queries and it's identified all of the data sources that it can find in my queries. And you can see here, the kind is identified by the little icon we've got here. That's a file, that's a SQL Server database, and here's the path that I was talking about. If I go to Global Permissions, I will see a list of all of the data sources that I've ever used in Power Query, in Power BI, at least on this particular machine. So it remembers all of the data sources that I've used. If we go back up to here, and we have a look at the Excel file that I was looking at, if I go to Edit Permissions, I'll get a dialog up. Different data sources will show slightly different things here, but look, there is a privacy level drop-down that I've got. So that's a data source. You would expect the Power Query engine to be able to find data sources quite easily, and it does. There is one exception. And this is something you've got to be a little bit wary of. If you're a bit too clever with writing M, it's possible to write data sources, to write queries with what are called dynamic data sources, where instead of having, for example, a fixed path to an Excel file, you use a little bit of code to generate the path to the file you want to load. Now, that's fine, that works. It leads to all kinds of problems later on, some of which are out of scope of this session. But one of the things it means is that if you've got dynamic code, then the Power Query engine can't actually evaluate the query, do its clever static analysis, and work out where the data sources are. And if it can't work out where the data sources are, how can you set a data privacy level for it? Well, it will prompt you when the query runs inside the Power Query editor, but you're going to be storing up problems for yourself later on after you've published. So, generally speaking, I would advise you avoid creating dynamic data sources. I've got an example of a dynamic data source here. At the moment, actually, this is not dynamic. This is a function that I've written to call a web service. So nothing really interesting up here. This is another data source that I'm going to be using a lot. It's a web service provided by the UK government to search for open data. It doesn't need any authentication. It's very straightforward. And at the moment, my search function here just searches for open data sets with the text Monday somewhere in the description. So this is a kind of fixed URL. This is going to be identified in the UI. But if I comment that out and uncomment this, you can see now I'm dynamically generating the URL because search term is the parameter I'm passing into the function, and I'm going to be searching for whatever is passed in through the UI. Now this is going to cause problems, as I said. So if we close this, having made that change, and go to data source settings, what we will see, hold on, did I actually save that? Advanced editor, nope, wrong one. Yeah, this comes of uncommenting things and not clicking done. There we go, go to data source settings. What you'll now see is a warning here that some data sources may not be listed because of hand-authored queries. If you see this inside your data source settings, you are going to be storing up problems for yourself later on. So avoid dynamic data sources. But you say, Chris, I need dynamic data sources. I've got to have dynamic data sources. Well, there are workarounds. So in this particular case, rather than concatenating search term onto the end of my URL, with web.contents, what we can do is use the query option in the second parameter of web.contents. And as soon as you do that, this is where the Power Query engine says, well, okay, I know you're going to be passing search terms to this web service, but at least I know what the root of the URL is, so I'm not going to treat this as a dynamic data source anymore. So if I click Done Now, you'll see the warning has gone away. And there are various other tricks you can play with other types of data source. Generally speaking, like I said, avoid doing this where possible. There will be other issues with credentials for refresh later on if you do this. Okay, so that's a little bit of an aside about hand-authored queries. Let's get on to privacy settings properly. So we've seen that privacy settings can be set for a data source. You can set them in advance in the data source settings dialog, or when you refresh a query and data source and the privacy levels need to be set, you will be prompted to do it. Now, if you haven't set privacy levels and you don't need to set privacy levels, the Power Query UI is not going to hassle you. But when you come to the point of needing to set data privacy levels, if you haven't done it, you're going to be prompted to say, right, you need to go away and set some data privacy levels. There will be some demos I do later where this is going to happen inevitably. And this is going to happen by default, but you can turn off data privacy checks completely. I'm going to show you how to do this, but I promise you this is not something you want to do by default. So in terms of settings, we go back to the main Power BI window. We go to File, Options and Settings, Options. And if we zoom in here, if you go to the global options and look at privacy, you've got three options. The default is always combine data to your privacy according to your privacy level settings. And this means that the privacy checks we're going to talk about in this session will be always applied. I strongly advise you to leave this like this. You've got a second option to combine data according to each file's privacy level settings. If you do this, and then we scroll down to current file privacy, you'd have to close and reopen Power BI Desktop. Actually, this is a little bit of a bug, but we've got two options here that will light up. And this will allow you to turn on or off data privacy checks for individual files. But again, I don't recommend you do that. And the final option is to always ignore data privacy level settings, which completely turns off data privacy checks. and we will talk about why you don't want to do that a little bit later as well. So I'm just going to leave that on here and click OK. So we've got these data privacy checks, we've got these data privacy levels set for a data source. What do these data privacy settings actually mean? So for an individual data source, there are 4 data privacy settings that we can choose from: private, organizational, public, and none. The rules are this. Data privacy level settings, as I said, are all about controlling how data goes, well, data can flow from one data source to another. If you've got 2 data sources which are marked as private, you can say that data from a private data source can never be sent anywhere else. Private data is going to be extremely sensitive. You don't want to send it anywhere else. Data from organizational data sources, however, can be sent to other organizational data sources. Maybe you've got some sensitive data sitting in an Excel spreadsheet somewhere in your company, but it doesn't need, you're not meant to let it leave the company, but it's okay to send it to other data sources like a SQL Server database somewhere inside your organization. So you can mark the 2 data sources as organizational, and because they're all inside the same organization, it's fine to send the data from one organizational data source to another. Data from public data sources can be sent anywhere because we don't care about the data. We can send it off to a web service, we can send it off to your mother, we can send it anywhere we want. So this is the general rule. Private can't be sent anywhere else. Organizational can stay within the organization. Public, we don't care, we can go anywhere else. There is a setting called none, which simply means that the data source level hasn't been set yet. We'll talk about that now. Now, none can be a little bit confusing because none means I haven't set the data source level. But there are a variety of different things that can happen here. If you've got a data source which is set to none, you may be prompted to set a data privacy level when the query runs. Alternatively, what might happen is the data privacy level might be inherited from somewhere else. So let's take a look at this. If we go back up to the Power Query editor, here is my selected day. Let's look at edit permissions. It's set to public. If I set this to none, then I'm not setting a data privacy level at all. I'm going to delete all the permissions and click OK and go to global permissions. However, under global permissions, you will see that I've got the root of my C drive listed here. The file we're talking about is on my C drive. So right now, if my file has got a data privacy level set to none, but I go on here and my C drive is set to public, then that file will inherit from the C drive because it's on the C drive, and it will be treated as public. So this can be quite confusing, and it can be quite difficult to work out. It happens with other different data sources as well. If we think about a SQL Server database, that can inherit from the instance that it's on. If we think about a web service, for example, this is the web service that I was showing you a little bit earlier, package search. If we look at the first part of the URL, this is the API. There are various different endpoints on there, and I could set the data privacy level at the high level there. So data privacy levels can be inherited. Can I take questions at the end, please? OK. One more bit of explanation. Data sources can be thought of as compatible if data from one source can be sent to another. So I've already said that you can't send data from a private data source anywhere else, but you can send data from a public source anywhere. So in terms of compatibility, because I can send data from a public data source to another public data sources, those 2 data sources can be thought of as being compatible. Similarly, organizational data can be sent to another organizational data source. They're compatible data sources. If I've got two private data sources, data from one can't be sent to the other. These are going to be incompatible data sources. So there's a bit of terminology. We'll come on to that a little bit later. Okay, so we've covered the groundwork. We know about data sources. We know about the different data privacy levels. Let's do some demos to kind of show how this actually works. And the big thing that I haven't talked about so far is how can you send data from one data source to another? Why would Power Query ever be sending data from one data source to another? Because aren't we all about loading data from external data sources into Power BI? So there is a situation where Power Query could send data from one data source to another. And this is when query folding takes place. Now, when the Power Query engine connects to a data source and you do some transformations, there is a choice about how it can do those transformations. It could load all of the raw data from the data source, bring it into the Power Query engine, and do all of the transformations there. But if you're working with large amounts of data, let's say you're connecting to a billion-row fact table and some Azure Synapse analytics type instance, trying to bring a billion-row fact table into the Power Query engine and do some filtering there, that would be crazy. Even if it could be loaded into the Power Query engine, you would probably find it was super slow. In that situation, the sensible thing to do would be to say, well, I want to do some transformation. Let's change that transformation into SQL and then just run the query against the data source and let the data source do all the hard work. That's basically what query folding is. It doesn't work for all data sources. It only works for data sources that A, have the concept of a query language, because with a SQL Server database, I can write a query against a SQL Server, against a table, and do some filtering and transformations. But if I'm connecting to a text file, there's no query language that I can use to do that. I've got no choice but to read all of the data in. So it only happens for some data sources and not others. And apart from relational databases, things like analysis services, OData data sources, a few others support query folding. And it doesn't happen for all transformations, because there's loads of fun stuff that you can do in Power Query that can never be translated back to, say, SQL, or can't be translated back yet because the developers haven't got around to doing it. So query folding is that scenario where data could be sent from one data source to another. Let's have a quick look at some query folding in action and how we can tell how query folding works. Here's a query that gets data from the dim date table. This is everything in dim date. Let's select some of the columns. So I'm just going to select the columns, remove other columns, and filter the rows so we only get the rows for Friday. We've done all the hard work. How do I know whether query folding is taking place? Well, with a SQL Server data source, what I can do is look at the list of steps, right-click on a step, and then View Native Query. If I do this, in this situation, View Native Query, I can see the SQL that has been generated from my query to get exactly the data I want from this SQL Server database. So you can see I removed the columns I didn't want and selected just 4. Those are the 4 that appear in the select clause. I wanted to filter just by Friday, and that's down there in the where clause. So that's query folding in action. Like I said, for SQL Server data sources, you can find out whether query folding is happening by right-clicking on a step. And if View Native Query is there, query folding is happening. If it's not, if it's disabled, query folding is not happening. Other data sources that support query folding don't support View Native Query. So just because View Native Query is grayed out doesn't mean that query folding isn't happening. It is not straightforward for other data sources to know whether it's happening or not, but the new diagnostics tool that we've got in the Power Query editor can help you a lot there by showing you the actual native queries that are being generated against the data source. But for SQL Server, we can say quite happily that view native query shows us whether query folding is taking place or not. So that's query folding. But that still doesn't explain how data could be sent from one source to another. Let's see an example. So we know we've got an Excel file with a table in it with the name of a day. We know that we've got the dim date table, and we can filter that dim date table as I just did, so we only get the rows for a particular day name. Think about this scenario. I'm getting the name of the day from my Excel file, and I've got a Power Query query that loads it into Power BI. If query folding takes place, what Power Query can do is grab the name of that day from Excel, and then when query folding is taking place, take that name of the day, put it into a SQL query that it runs against SQL Server, and run that query against SQL Server. So that's query folding working by taking the name of a day from one data source, putting it in the where clause of a query, and sending it to another. And what have we just done here? We've taken data from one data source, the Excel file, and because query folding is happening, we have sent it to another data source. Now, names of the days, they don't really matter that much, but if this was something sensitive like a social security number, I've just read what are we doing? Keeping social security numbers in Excel spreadsheets, but people do it, we know. I've just taken a social security number maybe, read it from Excel, put it in the where clause of a query, run it against a SQL Server database where some unscrupulous DBA will be looking at my queries, realizing that these are social security numbers in the where clause, and we've committed some kind of crime, a data privacy breach. We're going to be going to prison. We're going to be fined for millions of dollars. We're going to lose our job. All kinds of terrible things could happen just because we wanted our Power Query queries to run fast. Now, let's see this in action. If we go back to the Power Query editor here, what I've got is the same query that I showed you, except that where I'm filtering the rows, instead of hard coding a day name, I'm getting the value got by this day name value query. And this query up here is a query that connects to the Excel workbook, goes to the day name table, and gets that name here from Excel. So this is exactly the scenario that I was just talking about. And checking that my Excel file up here is going to be set to public. That's where I'm getting the data from, so it's important to have that set to public at first. SQL Server is going to be set to public here as well. When I refresh this, we get the rows we're expecting. We've read that Monday from Excel, used that day name to filter the SQL Server table. I can right-click here, View Native Query, and there we are. We've got the day name Monday. So in this case, because the Excel file has a data privacy level set to public, I don't mind taking data from one place and sending it to the other. So that's what's happened. What happens, though, if I change the Excel file to private? This is where the complexity comes in. So I'm going to show you what's going to happen here, but there are a variety of different things that can happen. This is where things start to get a little bit complicated. So I've set the Excel file's data privacy level to private. I click OK. I go back to my main query here, refresh it. It works, but something different has happened. So if I right-click on filtered rows, you'll see that the View Native Query option has now been grayed out. Because the data privacy rules that I've just talked about have said, I can't send data from that Excel data source to anywhere else. So how's the query worked? Well, in this case, something different has happened. What's happened is we've got the data from Excel. We've taken that day name, and we put it into the Power Query engine. Simultaneously, we've gone to SQL Server. We've done effectively a select star from dim date. It doesn't actually do a select star. It actually just, no, I promise you, it does get the column names, but I didn't have enough room to put all of that in the slide. So it's got everything from the dim date table, loaded that into the Power Query engine, and done the filtering there. So it's played by the rules. It's not sent data from Excel to the SQL Server database. In order to get around that, or to play by that rule, it's had to get everything from the dim date table and load that into Power Query and do the filtering there. So query folding has not taken place. The query is still run, but it might well be slower. So as a result, what we might find with query folding, if you've got compatible data sources, query folding might take place. Performance is going to be good. For incompatible data sources, in this case, the query still ran because we were able to buffer all of the data from that dim date table inside the Power Query engine and do the filtering there. But as we know, buffering tables in memory and doing all those transformations in the Power Query engine, well, it'll try and do it as efficiently as possible, but we're on shaky ground as far as performance goes. So we probably want query folding to take place. There's another possible thing that can happen when we've got incompatible data sources. If you've got incompatible data sources, you might find that the query you want to run can't run at all. It all comes down to whether you can buffer all of the data from the different data sources inside the Power Query engine. Let's say that instead of getting the data from Excel and passing it to SQL Server, we want to get that same data from Excel and pass it to a web service. We want to go to that web service I was talking about that gets open data. Now, how can I call that web service without taking the name of the day of the week and putting it in the URL and sending it in the request to the web service? There is no way that query can possibly run if the Excel file is going to be marked as private. If Excel is marked as public, what's going to happen is I'm going to get the data from Excel, the name of my day of the week, send it up to Power BI, embed it in a request, and send it to the web service. But that's only going to be possible if it's public. Let's see this in action. I've got yet another query up here called call web service. You can see when I've got Excel set to private, I can't send the data from Excel to the web service. The web service call can't succeed, and I get an error message here. So this is the first of the infamous error messages that we'll see as a result of data privacy settings, and it says, this step is accessing data sources that have got privacy levels which cannot be used together. Please rebuild this data combination. What can we do here? The only thing we can do is change the data privacy level. So this is the first error that we're going to encounter. And it's a bit of a problem. Now, let's go a little bit deeper into what might go on. So we've talked a little bit about buffering and query folding and so on. But at a much deeper level, there are some quite complex things that go on inside the Power Query engine when data privacy levels are evaluated. What happens when queries start to run is the Power Query engine looks at all of the steps in your queries, and it groups them all together into things called partitions. Partitions are groups of steps which access either usually a single data source or combine data from other partitions. There are all kinds of complex rules that govern how these partitions are created, but the bad news is there is absolutely nothing in the Power Query engine that tells you how partitioning is done, that shows you for your query which steps are in which partitions. So how do I know about partitions? Well, the only way that you might possibly know about partitions is if you hang around on the Power Query MSDN forum. There was a post about 6 months, maybe a little bit longer ago, a kind of white paper level post by a guy called Aaron on the Power Query dev team, who wrote part 1 of a series that was never completed on Power Query data privacy settings. And here he talks about partitions and how they work. It's very interesting. I suggest you go away and read it. But from the point of view of actually doing anything practical in the real world, until we've got some tools that allow us to see which steps get put in which partitions and how data flows between those partitions, it's all very, very theoretical. I was hoping that the new Power Query diagnostics tool would tell us something about this, but it doesn't. So by all means, go away and have a read of that. But I'm not going to go into too much detail because A, it's complicated and time-consuming, and B, there is absolutely no practical use for this until you can apply it to your own queries. But broadly speaking, if we look at the queries that we were just looking at, the query on the right, the steps, the ones for the dim date query filtered by the data from Excel. The one on the left is the query that gets the data from the Excel file. All of the steps from the Excel query are all put into the same partition. The first 3 steps, which are the ones that just connect to the SQL Server database and say, let's go to the dim date table, they're all put in a partition. And then there is a third partition that does the filtering. That is the step that says, let's take that table in SQL Server and apply the filter so we only get the rows for that particular day name. Now, imagining these 3 partitions, when you've got these partitions, there is something called the firewall inside Power Query that whenever you've got groups of partitions and data needs to flow between them, that data has to go through the firewall. And the firewall, when data goes from one partition to another, has a choice about what it can do. It can either let the data go from one place to another, it can stop it completely, or it can buffer the data. And we've already seen examples of all of these things happening. We've seen queries working fine and query folding happening. We've seen queries working fine but buffering happening in memory. And we've seen queries that completely fail to run because you can't pass data from one data source to another. But generally speaking, the rule is when you've got data going from one partition to another, a single partition can either access compatible data sources, or it can reference other partitions, but it can't do both. Now, if you break this rule, this is where you get to the most difficult, unpleasant error that you will ever come across in the whole of Power BI. It is this step references other queries or steps, so it can't directly access a data source error. This is the thing that strikes fear into the heart of every Power Query developer. And when you hit that error, you know that you've broken that rule of creating partitions that try to A, access a data source and get data from another partition. What can we do about this? Well, things are limited because we have no idea which partitions our steps are in. But in the true tradition of hacking developers, there are lots of different things, lots of different tricks we can play. Okay, let's see some examples of queries where this particular error comes up. Let's have a look at the classic example here. So here's a query with that error that I was talking about. And let's see what I did to get this error. So we know that we've got the dim date table in SQL Server, and we know we've got a query that gets data from that Excel file and returns just the name of the day of the week. What I've done is I've written some M code, and this query has a single step in it, just one called filtered rows. And in that single step, I've written code that gets data from SQL Server from the dim date table and gets all of the data in it. And in that same step, uses the table.selectRows function to filter that table so that we're only getting the data which is the day of the week. So I've done everything in one mega big long step. A partition, the lowest level of granularity for a partition, is a single step. So this is one partition that both gets data from a data source and accesses data from another partition, and that other partition is the day name value query. So I've broken that golden rule, and I've got the error that I was talking about. And in the simplest situation, when I know that I've got this error and I've broken that golden rule, how can I get away from the error? Don't try to do everything in a single step. So if you can break things up into multiple steps, you might find that the query works. So if we click on here, here is a working version of the query. If I go to the advanced editor, you can see what I've done. I've got exactly the same expressions, except that now I've broken it all up into 3 steps. I've got the step source, which gets the data from the AdventureWorks DW 2017 database. This gets the data from the dim date table. And this says, let's get that data and filter it by the values that are coming back from here. Query folding will work quite happily on this. It's just by breaking this up into multiple steps, we've given the Power Query engine opportunity to break this up into separate partitions, and the formula firewall can do its work. So that's the classic scenario. There are other different scenarios where this error might come up. One of the more famous examples of this, where there was a blog post written several years ago, was from Ken Poles, who is one of the other famous Power Query bloggers out there. His post was written in 2015, so I thought I would rather shamelessly try and steal his example back from then to demonstrate this error. The bad news is that his post seems to be out of date, and the error that he described doesn't take place anymore. Or rather, when I was preparing the demo, I could have sworn I managed to recreate the error, but then today, half an hour before the session, I thought, well, I'll just check my demos one more time, and the query that I thought was going to produce an error didn't produce an error. But at the same time, I found another scenario where I got this error and another workaround for it. So let's have a look at the other workaround. So here's a query that does something quite similar. We know we've got our Excel file here, but now I've got a third file called filename.txt with the path to my Excel file. So what I'm doing here is I've got a query that gets data from filename.txt and gets the path of my Excel file. And then here, my query just returns the path of the Excel file. And in this particular query, I'm going to need to uncomment some stuff out because this is a dynamic data source. What this query does is it says, let's open an Excel workbook, but instead of hard coding the path to the Excel workbook, I'm saying get file.contents, and file name is the query that I just showed you that got the path for the Excel file. This is enough to cause the error. Because again, what we're trying to do is we get data from another data source, the file that gets the data, that gives me the path, and then pass it through. This only happens when I'm getting the data, the path dynamically from a file. If I was getting this from a partition, there's some special code inside the Power Query engine that knows that we're getting data from, from a parameter rather, and it won't give me the error in that situation. But there's another workaround that I found. What I've done is I've taken my file name query and I've edited it slightly. And now, instead of just being a query that returns some values, I've turned it into a function. So in M, we can write functions. This function has no parameters, but I'm just going to call this function and get exactly the same value back. So if I was to invoke this function, I would just get the same value back. And it turns out now, if I uncomment this, the only difference with this query is that instead of calling a query that returned a text value, I'm now calling a function which returns a text value. File name function returns that text value, and it turns out that that is enough to make it all work, or it should do. Come on. All right. I promise you this did work earlier. It did. This is a notoriously buggy area, but all right. That should have worked. Anyway, let's move on swiftly. Here's another query that fails to work. And this is easier to understand. So we want query folding to happen, but we don't want to rely on the Power Query engine to actually do that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to dynamically generate some SQL. So I'm getting the same, well, I'm getting 2 columns from my dim date table, but I've got a where clause here that I'm going to construct, and I'm going to inject day name value into the where clause. You know, again, maybe not good practice to do, but for demo purposes, I want to show something nice and clear. In this situation, again, we get that particular error because, again, what I've got is a single step that tries to get data from 2 different data sources, breaking that rule. The question is, how can I do this? How can I possibly manage to pass dynamically the day name from Excel into the where clause here and get around this? This is a little bit more difficult. If we have a look here in this version of the query, which does work, what I've done is instead of having separate queries, one query that gets the data from Excel and another query that calls SQL Server, if I put all of that code in one big query, that's enough for it to rejig the way the partitions are created and for the rules to be met and everything to work. So one way that you can work around this particular problem if you've got lots of referenced queries is don't use referenced queries. Basically take all of your code and put it into one big query. A bit more difficult to manage, but it will get around that particular data privacy problem, which is incidentally exactly the opposite of the advice that Ken Pulse gives in his blog post from 2015 that I was trying to reproduce. There's another option here as well. This is a query that does not have everything all inside one big query. I'm still using a separate query to get the data from Excel, but what I've got here, instead of using one function to get the data, there is a function called value.native query that actually allows me to pass parameter values into a query. So instead of dynamically generating my SQL query, I've got a SQL query with a parameter in it, and then I can pass a parameter called filter parameter in here and pass the value of day name value into that. And it turns out that is enough to get around the data privacy rules. And this query works as well. So there we are. There are various other different things. Generally speaking, because you've got no idea how the partitioning works for your query, it's going to be trial and error to get around this particular error. You could either put all your steps into one big query. You can take your queries and break them up into multiple different referenced queries. You can try and do different things by maybe merging rather than filtering. I've seen that work in the past. You can use basically different approaches, but it's trial and error. I'm not going to pretend that there is any logic that I know about. Unless you're the developer who knows how this partitioning is likely to work, there is no good solution here, unfortunately. Ultimately, you might just end up crying or throwing your PC against the wall in frustration, or turning off data privacy settings, which, like I said, is a very bad idea. Moving on, another interesting topic with data privacy is its impact on overall performance. So, something that I've noticed quite often over the years is that even when you've got queries that run absolutely fine, even when query folding is happening absolutely fine, the fact that the Power Query engine has to do all of this partitioning and work out where data is going from one place to another and apply these data privacy checks means that there is a performance overhead simply from doing the data privacy checks. So nothing to do with query folding, nothing to do with anything else. It is purely the overhead of applying these checks which can make complex queries with typically lots and lots of different reference values, very, very slow. You recognize them by, generally, they've got a very slow evaluating phase. If you watch a slow Power Query run, you might notice that in the dialog box that comes up, there is a spinny box that says evaluating, and then after a while, you'll start to see rows coming in from your data source. It's that evaluating phase where, amongst other things, the data privacy checks are applied. Now, this is an area where the new diagnostic tooling can be useful. So what it should be possible to do is to actually see extra things happening as a result of the data privacy checks. In some cases, you might find, as a result of the data privacy checks, the Power Query engine gets more data or runs more queries against your data source. So let's see how that happens. So I've got a query here that actually does load data into my data set. And it's basically the same query that we've just seen. It's one that gets data from dim date, applies a filter. It works. And what we should see is that query folding is taking place. This is not my day for demos, but it just works. It doesn't really matter where the query folding takes place. How can we measure the overhead? Well, if I go to Tools, I'm going to start the diagnostics. And there's a little bit of a trick here. I'm not interested in refreshing the preview in here. To really know what happens when you refresh a table in a data set, you've got to refresh a table in a data set. So what you do is you start diagnostics, and then you go back to the main Power Query window, Power BI window, right-click, and refresh data. Hold on a minute. Let's stop this. And we'll just close and apply. That's because there's that there's an invoked function, doesn't matter. Right, so let's go back up to Edit Queries, go to Tools, Start Diagnostics, and let's refresh this. It's going to be very, very quick, but we've done the refresh from the main Power BI window. When I stop diagnostics, I've got these two queries here that give me detailed and kind of summarized values. And stuff is happening here. Doesn't matter too much about what's happening. The important thing is you can see there are 209 rows, 209 individual operations that have taken place. Something that might make things a little bit easier to see is under data source query, because we're going against a SQL Server database, we can see a number of SQL queries that have been generated here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the nulls. So let's right-click on a cell with a null in, go to text filters, doesn't equal, and I've got all of the rows here that are getting data from the SQL Server database that are generating SQL queries. And now there are 9 rows. If I go back up to here, go to Options and Settings, Options, and do what I told you never to do, which is always ignore data privacy level checks. Let's click OK. Come on, there we go. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start diagnostics again, go back up to here, do the same thing, and refresh data. It's going to load the data without applying the data privacy checks. Go back up to here, stop. Here is my new query. You can see now instead of 209 rows, we've only got 158 rows. We'll do the same filter. Let's get rid of the null values here. Text filters doesn't equal. We've only got 7 rows, whereas before we had 9. If you look down here, we know that this query should have query folding taking place. It does take place, or maybe it doesn't. But anyway, there's a query that gets the data. When data privacy checks are applied, I've also got this extra query up here that says select top 4,096 rows from the data source. This is it doing a little bit of profiling, getting some data to understand what's going on. if we have a look here for this particular query, that top 4,096 rows query is not there. So that's a query that's been generated as a result of the data privacy checks to kind of work out what data is in there. You can imagine that on a big table, maybe this is going to take some time to run. And by turning off the data privacy checks, we stop that happening. There's obviously a whole load of other stuff that's not happening anymore that I have no idea what's going on about. But less stuff is happening, and you can imagine that less is going to be better for performance. All right. Everything we've talked about so far has been in Power BI Desktop. And it's all very relevant and very important for when you're developing. But what happens in desktop is not necessarily carried on when you publish up to the Power BI service. So if you're familiar with Power BI and publishing, you will know that you set up a data source in Power BI Desktop, you publish. When you publish up to the service, and if you're getting data from an on-prem data source, the first thing you have to do is make sure that data source is defined in your on-premises gateway and all of the credentials are set up. And guess what? When you publish, the data privacy levels are not sent up to the Power BI service either, in the same way that the credentials aren't or anything else. So you also have to remember to set up your data privacy levels in the Power BI service, in the gateway. So you can see this in the Manage Gateway screen. So if I go to Power BI here, I'm going to go to Manage Gateways to my on-prem gateway. And here is my data source connecting back to SQL Server. And if I go to Advanced Settings, you can see right at the bottom, I can set my privacy levels down here for my data source. So something you have to remember to do. There is a problem with this, though. Lots of people, when they encounter data privacy problems in Power BI Desktop, have a quick Google, think, oh, how am I going to solve this problem? Find somebody saying, oh, just turn it off in Power BI Desktop, turn off the data privacy checks, everything's going to be fine. And then they publish up to the service, and guess what? There's no way to turn off data privacy checks once you've published up to the Power BI service. Well, there is. If you're using a personal gateway, not an enterprise gateway, there is a registry hack or something for a personal gateway that you can use that will turn off all data privacy checks for everything that goes through the personal gateway. Somebody told me that it also exists for the enterprise gateway, but it's only documented and supported for personal gateways. But anyway, this is not something you want to do at all, because when you turn it off at the gateway level, that applies to every single data source, and obviously that is a bad thing. So don't turn off data privacy checks in Power BI Desktop unless you know that that your queries are going to run and refresh after you've published. Otherwise, you're going to be in big trouble. There are some other things to bear in mind, other workarounds. So let's say that you're in one of these situations where you're getting strange errors, and you think, okay, well, I have no idea how to rewrite my query to get around a firewall error. How can I make my queries refresh when they've published up to the service? There are two options. The first option, maybe the more obscure option, is to write a custom connector. So if you can take all of the code from your queries and encapsulate it in a Power Query custom connector, that is one way to get around the problem, because code inside Power Query custom connectors does not have data privacy checks applied to it. The problem with this approach is that you've got a very limited number of data sources that you can actually use inside a custom connector. For example, you can't actually connect to a text file from a custom connector. You can only connect to ODBC or ADO or OLEDB data sources or Webb data sources. So this isn't really a truly satisfying workaround to that problem of not being able to refresh in the service. A much better idea is to use data flows. Now, obviously, I work for Microsoft now, and I've got to push all the latest cool stuff, and I'm going to try and push you into using data flows. But this is actually a genuinely useful feature, because when you've got Power Query code running inside data flows, you've got the option for an individual data flow to turn off data privacy checks. Indeed, this is something that is turned off by default, and it seems as though even when you try and turn it off, it turns off the data privacy checks anyway. So let's see an example of this. Let's go up to here, let's go to my workspace, and let's have a look at data flows, and let's look at the data flow we've got here. This is basically the same demo that I've been doing over and over again. I edit entities. This is a data flow on a premium capacity, but what I'm doing here is something that will work on shared capacity as well. I've got my day name query that returns my day name from Excel. I've got my dim date table here that gets all of my days of the week. These two queries have got enable load deselected, so they're not going anywhere. The only thing that's going to be loaded in is this referenced entity demo query here. If I go to the advanced editor, you can see that I am doing the same thing that I did before, basically filtering my list of rows from dim date by the name of the day of the week coming from Excel. Now, when you've got your source queries with enable load turned off, referencing works in exactly the same ways that it does in Power BI Desktop. Query folding takes place. If you go up to Options up here and go to Project Options, you can see that you've got this checkbox here, which is checked by default, saying allow combining data from multiple data sources. This means that your data privacy checks are turned off by default. If I deselect this option, now, interestingly, both of these data sources are set to public, so I would have thought this would work. But if I go to here and refresh the preview, it says, evaluation was cancelled because combining data from multiple data sources might reveal data from one source to another. I've set these data sources to public. I'd have thought this would work. But if I click continue, it works. It's not a warning. If you go up to the project options, you can see that it's selected the box and turned off data privacy settings. So I'm not even sure there's a way of enforcing data privacy checks here in a data flow. Anyway, let's do that. I'm going to let it refresh now, and just to prove that query folding takes place, let's refresh now. We're going to go to Profiler, and there is my query. It's all working in the way you would expect. So there's my where clause with the day name in. That's fine. Now, there is something that you have to worry about, or at least watch out for, when you're using premium data flow on premium capacity. Let's close this. This is basically a demo that does more or less exactly the same thing. But in this case, there are some differences. There's one crucial difference. It is namely that I have not disabled the load for these queries. So this and this, the output of these two queries, code is exactly the same, but they're being loaded into the data flow. And what we've got here now, instead of a reference query like we might have on Power BI Desktop, we've got this icon with a little Harry Potter flash on it. This is now a computed entity. Now, with a computed entity, the important thing is, even though the code is the same, this computed entity is no longer getting the data directly from the data source. With computed entities, what happens is that day name and dim date, these queries will be run. The output is staged inside the data flow. The actual output is going to be stored in Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. And with my computed entity, when this runs, it's going to get the data from the data that's been stored in the data lake storage managed by Power BI and combined like this. As a result, we're not getting the data from the data sources. The same rules for data privacy are not going to apply because we're getting the data from effectively the same data source. There's also a little performance side effect of this as well. So when I run this and save and close, Let's go back to Profiler and close that. I'm going to get the refresh now. What do you think the SQL query that's going to be run is? Remember, I've got a query that gets the day name from Excel. I've got another query that gets all of the data from the dim date table in SQL Server, loads it into the data flow and stages it. As a result, what we're going to see here is a query that gets everything from dim date with no where clause. The filtering is now going to be done on the full dim date table coming inside the computed entity, which might be slower. So you need to watch out for that. Pardon me. It's all right, we're coming to the end. Okay. In summary, the one thing that I'm sure you've all taken away from this particular session is that data privacy is difficult. I didn't talk about it, but the developers also admitted there were kind of bugs and inconsistencies, and I swear that demo that was working just then, I promise you that was giving me that error half an hour ago. So there is obviously all kinds of inconsistencies still in Power BI Desktop, depending on what data sources you access in particular orders and whether you've got things turned on. That was not me screwing up. That was Power BI Desktop. So the takeaway is data privacy is just plain difficult. Don't worry if you're upset by it. It's hard for everybody. But the important thing is don't turn off the data privacy checks in Power BI Desktop when you first get those errors. Instead, try and rework your queries, set your data privacy levels appropriately, rewrite your queries to maybe try and make partitioning work and things happen so that you can avoid the errors. Because if you don't do that and you publish up to the service, you might find that your queries don't run. Alternatively, it might all work, but you're going to be sending data from one data source to another, and you commit a data privacy breach. And of course, you might end up losing your job. So don't absolutely do that. Understand data privacy settings, edit them, make sure they work. And if all else fails, try to convert everything into a data flow where, as we've seen, the data privacy checks are not applied and everything should work okay. That brings me to the end. We've got 5 minutes left. Does anybody want to ask any questions about this? Yes, sir. You wanted a question earlier, and it's time now.
About the data flows.
Yes.
When we of the data source, how to solve?
So the question is, to repeat the question, you're saying that when you build a data flow and you build your M query in Power BI Desktop and then copy and paste the code up into the advanced editor and try and build the query like that, you run into problems with the gateway because the gateway gets confused and doesn't recognize the data sources, and what you're trying to do doesn't work. I think I understood that.
The query works, but the query demands from the person that is copying the query, which is the developer, the password of the data source.
I've not seen it demand the password of the data source, but I do know there are all kinds of problems with copying and pasting M code into a data flow. These are problems that are being worked on, and I know that there are something that was announced at Ignite this week is the validation stage after you create a query in a data flow is going to be something that you can optionally turn off. And I would imagine that would also solve the problem that you have run into as well. But data flows are still relatively new. There are some bugs and some issues that are being ironed out, and I would imagine that the thing that you've seen is going to be one of those other things that gets dealt with. Next question.
Maybe, what is the whole point of setting all the privacy things?
Okay, so the question is, if you're on Power BI Desktop, you're setting the data privacy levels, what's the point of doing it if they don't get published after you send up to the server? So remember, whether you're developing or whether you've got something in production, there is still a chance that data could be sent from one data source to another. So it makes sense to have those settings in Power BI Desktop and in the service, because regardless of whether you're developing or whether you've got a query that's in production, there's still the same risk. You still could be sending data from one data source to another. So that's maybe the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, why do those settings not get published up when you publish? Well, this is the same with credentials. So the data privacy levels are kind of associated with the credentials and all of the other things. And certainly when you publish up to Power BI, you might, as a developer, be using a different set of credentials to access the data source compared to the credentials that are being used by the Power BI service. For example, you might be using Windows authentication against a SQL Server database because you as a user have got that set up. If you're publishing up to the Power BI service, you probably don't want to be using your own username and password. You're going to maybe have a separate username set up. Maybe you want to use a different form of authentication completely for the data set after it's been published. So that's why there's that separation. In terms of the data privacy levels, they are kind of inextricably linked to the credentials. But there's also an argument to say that some developer could set data source level data privacy settings in one way, but it's really important that when things have gone up to production for a gateway administrator or somebody who's really got the interests of the company at heart to be able to change and set those data privacy levels and set them by default. So that's kind of why there's that split there. I think that there are good reasons for it. It's something that I found quite confusing when I first started using Power BI, but when you think about it, I think there's a strong argument for the way things are. Yes, sir.
What other scenarios you saw where the privacy would be critical with a SQL Server or another set?
Okay, so your question was to summarize that most of the time if you're using SQL Server, data privacy is not an issue because SQL Server is all inside the same organization. So maybe it's relevant for web services like an OData data source, but it's not relevant for SQL Server. That's basically what you're saying, I think. So I would argue that in lots of cases there are issues where you're connecting to SQL Server and you do have these issues. Certain industries like insurance, other financial services industries have got different areas inside the same organization where data can't be moved around. So we have to support those as well. So even within an organization, there are going to be situations where actually there is, highly sensitive data that can't be sent to another data source, even though that other data source is inside the same organization. So I would say that's why these data privacy settings are kind of set everywhere. I mean, this is a horrendously complicated problem, and it's one of those things that everybody complains about, but if you think about it, there's probably no other solution to the problem than the one we've got. If you didn't have this issue, then remember Power Query is not only in Power BI, it's also in Excel. It would just take one particular data breach from somebody doing something in Power BI or Excel and somebody saying, Excel leaks data, it's insecure. The world runs on Excel. There would be front page headlines everywhere and Microsoft would take a beating. We've got a reputation that we have to uphold, which is why we have to be a pain in the arse and enforce rules like this, even though you might think that this is something that nobody should ever care about and it would be much better if we could just turn all this stuff off. So yeah, I know it's a pain, but it's something we have to enforce and something that therefore you have to understand and live with. Any more questions? Yes, one more question. There are. I will be reporting this particular bug to the relevant developers, I think. But yes, they seem to happen. I believe there are bugs that happen to do with the order that you access data sources. So yeah, clearing the permissions seems to be one way of of kind of resetting things and going on. But yeah, so the question was, sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. It looks like clearing the credentials is one way to kind of reset this buggy behavior. The answer is yes, that appears to be the case, but these are bugs that need to be fixed. All right, thank you very much. The next lot of presenters are waiting. I'll be around to take questions afterwards.